Stop trying to be what you think I want. Show me who you really are. The words hung in the air of Studio 6B at NBC Burbank like a challenge and an invitation all at once. 19-year-old Jim Carrey stood frozen at the microphone, his carefully rehearsed stand-up routine dying on his lips, as Johnny Carson looked at him with an expression that was equal parts disappointment and curiosity. It was November 1978, and Jim Carrey was bombing on the most important stage of his young life. But what happened in the next 4 minutes would not only save his Tonight Show debut, it would teach him the most important lesson of his career, that pretending to be someone else, even to please your heroes, is the fastest way to fail. Before we dive into this incredible story, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to witness proves that sometimes the biggest risk is not taking one at all. To understand why this moment mattered so much, you need to know what brought Jim Carrey to that Tonight Show stage in the first place. Jim grew up in Newmarket, Ontario, a small town outside Toronto where dreams of Hollywood stardom seemed as distant as the moon. His family wasn't just poor, they were devastatingly poor in a way that shaped everything about who Jim would become. His father, Percy, worked as an accountant, but in 1975, when Jim was 13, Percy lost his job. The Carey family's descent into poverty was swift and brutal. Within months, they were living in a Volkswagen van, parked in various locations around Newmarket, trying to stay warm during brutal Canadian winters, trying to maintain some shred of dignity while using public restroom facilities to wash up before school. Jim's mother, Kathleen, suffered from chronic illness and depression, spending days in bed, unable to cope with their circumstances. His father, despite being a naturally funny man who had once dreamed of being a comedian himself, fell into a depression that made him almost unrecognizable. The weight of failure, of not being able to provide for his family, crushed Percy Carey's spirit. Jim watched his father's light dim day by day, watched a man who could make anyone laugh lose the ability to smile, and Jim made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would use comedy to save his family. Not metaphorically, literally. He would make them laugh when there was nothing to laugh about. He would be the light in their darkness. At 14 years old, Jim started performing at Yuk Yuk's Comedy Club in Toronto. He was far too young to be in a bar legally, but the owner made an exception because Jim was different from other comedians. He didn't tell jokes. He became other people. Jim had discovered early on that he had a gift for impressions that went beyond simple mimicry. When Jim did an impression, he didn't just sound like the person. He transformed into them. His face would contort. His body would reshape itself. His entire being would channel whoever he was portraying. It was unsettling and mesmerizing at the same time. His impressions of celebrities like Jimmy Stewart, Sammy Davis Jr., and Henry Fonda were so accurate that audience members would sometimes gasp in recognition. But more than the technical skill, Jim brought something else to his performances, a manic energy, a desperate need to make people laugh that came from watching his family suffer. Every laugh he got from an audience felt like a small victory against the poverty and despair that threatened to consume them. By 1977, at just 15 years old, Jim was a regular performer at Yuk Yuk's, making enough money to help his family move out of the van and into a small apartment. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, it was progress, and it was all because Jim could make people laugh by becoming someone else. The Toronto comedy scene started buzzing about this kid who did impressions unlike anything anyone had seen before. Agents started showing up at his performances. Talent scouts from American shows began taking notice. And in early 1978, something incredible happened. Jim Macaulay, same legendary Tonight Show talent coordinator who had discovered David Brenner and dozens of other comedians, was in Toronto scouting talent. Someone told him he had to see this teenager at Yuk Yuk's who was doing something special. Macaulay went to see Jim perform and was immediately struck by the kid's raw talent. The impressions were technically perfect, but what really got Macaulay's attention was Jim's commitment This wasn't a comedian doing impressions. This was an artist completely inhabiting other people. After the show, Macaulay introduced himself to Jim. "I'd like to get you on The Tonight Show," Macaulay said. Jim, who was 17 at the time, thought he was being pranked. "The Tonight Show? With Johnny Carson? That's not possible. I'm nobody." But Macaulay was serious. There was just one problem. When Macaulay brought Jim's audition tape back to NBC and showed it to the producers, they loved the impressions. But when they showed it to Johnny Carson, Johnny's reaction was complicated. "The kid's talented," Johnny said. "Watching Jim's tape, very talented, but I don't want another impressionist on my show. We've had 100 impressionists. I want to see if he can do real stand-up comedy. If he can write jokes. If he can be himself on stage, not just other people." Macaulay called Jim with the news. "Johnny wants you on the show, but he doesn't want you to do impressions. He wants you to do stand-up, pure stand-up." Jim's heart sank. "Stand-up? But that's not what I do. That's not who I am." "I know," Macaulay said, "but this is The Tonight Show. This is Johnny Carson. If you want the opportunity, these are the terms." Jim faced an impossible choice. He could turn down the biggest opportunity of his young life, or he could pretend to be something he wasn't. He chose the opportunity. For the next 8 months, Jim worked on developing a stand-up routine. He wrote jokes about being Canadian, about growing up poor, about his family's struggles. The material was decent. Some of it was even funny, but it wasn't Jim Carrey. It was Jim trying to be a traditional stand-up comedian. And it felt wrong from the beginning. His father, Percy, who had somewhat recovered from his depression and was working again, watched Jim rehearse the new material. "This isn't you, son," Percy said one night after watching Jim practice. "Where are the voices? Where's the energy?" Jim explained Johnny Carson's requirement. "Forget Johnny Carson," Percy said with unusual intensity. "The reason you're getting this opportunity in the first place is because you're different. If you go on that show and try to be like everyone else, you'll fail. But if you show them who you really are, you might fail too. But at least you'll fail as yourself." Jim heard his father's words but ignored them. He was 19 years old and scared. He convinced himself that if he could just get on The Tonight Show, if he could just do well with the stand-up, then maybe later he could show them his impressions. He just needed to get his foot in the door. Jim Carrey stood backstage at The Tonight Show, wearing a suit he'd bought at a thrift store in Toronto, holding joke cards that felt like they belonged to someone else. He watched Johnny Carson's monologue on the green room monitor and felt his stomach twist into knots. This was everything he'd worked for, everything his family needed, but nothing about it felt right. A production assistant appeared at the door. "You're up in 5 minutes, Mr. Carrey." Jim walked down the hallway toward the stage, his footsteps echoing exactly like David Brenner's had 6 years earlier in the same building. He could hear the audience laughing at something Johnny had said. He reached the curtain, and "Our next guest is a very funny young comedian from Toronto, Canada," Johnny's voice announced, making his American television debut. "Please welcome Jim Carrey." The curtain opened. Jim walked out to polite applause, waved awkwardly, and took his position at the microphone. And then he began his stand-up routine. The jokes about being Canadian, the observations about cultural differences, the bits about his family. They were fine. They were competent. They were completely forgettable. The audience gave polite laughs, not big laughs, not the kind of response that launched careers. Polite acknowledgement that jokes had been told. From his desk, Johnny Carson watched with growing disappointment. This kid had been described to him as a once-in-a-generation talent, but what Johnny was seeing was a nervous teenager telling mediocre jokes. There was nothing special here, nothing that justified the hype. Jim made it through about 3 minutes of his 6 minute set, getting increasingly desperate as he felt the audience slipping away. His delivery got faster, more frantic. He started rushing through jokes, not giving them room to breathe, and that's when he made a fatal mistake. In his panic, Jim started to slip into a voice, just for a second, a tiny bit of an impression creeping into his delivery. He caught himself and stopped, but it was too late. Johnny had seen it. Johnny stood up from his desk, something he rarely did during a comedian set. Jim, Johnny said, his voice cutting through the studio. Stop for a second. Come over here. Jim's face went pale. This was it. He was being thrown off the Tonight Show on live television. His career was over. Before it started, he walked over to Johnny's desk, his legs barely supporting him. Sit down, Johnny said, gesturing to the guest chair. Jim sat, his hands shaking. Johnny looked at him with an expression that was hard to read. I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me, Johnny said. What do you really do? What do you mean? Jim asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I watched your audition tape, Johnny continued. I saw the impressions. I told them I didn't want impressions on my show. I wanted to see if you could do real comedy. But watching you up there, just now, I realized I made a mistake. The real comedy is what you're not showing me. You're dying up there, trying to be something you're not. So I'm going to give you a choice. You can finish your stand-up routine. We'll thank you politely, and you'll go home, having done exactly what I asked, but failed anyway. Or you can stop trying to be what you think I want, and show me who you really are. The audience was completely silent. This wasn't part of the show. This was real. I don't understand, Jim said, tears forming in his eyes. Show me the impressions, Johnny said. Show me what you do when you're not trying to please me. Show me why everyone in Toronto thinks you're special. I was wrong to ask you to hide your talent. Sometimes the rules need to be broken. Jim stared at Johnny Carson, hardly believing what he was hearing. You want me to do impressions right now? Johnny said, right now. Forget the stand-up. Forget what I told you before. Just be yourself. And something broke open inside Jim Carrey. All the fear, all the desperation to please, all the pretending. It all fell away. He stood up from the guest chair, walked back to the microphone, and for the first time since walking onto that stage, he was himself. Jim started with an impression of Johnny Carson himself. It was bold. It was risky. But it was brilliant. He captured not just Johnny's voice, but his entire presence, his timing, his mannerisms. The audience erupted in laughter. Johnny himself was laughing, genuinely delighted. Then Jim shifted into Jimmy Stewart, his whole body transforming, his face reshaping itself into the beloved actor's distinctive features. Then Sammy Davis Jr., then Henry Fonda, then back to Johnny Carson, doing an impression of Jimmy Stewart. The audience was roaring now. This wasn't just comedy. This was artistry. Jim did 4 more minutes of pure, unfiltered Jim Carrey. The manic energy that had been trapped inside him during the stand-up routine exploded across the stage. His face became rubber. His body became liquid. His voice became an instrument that could channel anyone in the audience. Loved every second of it. When he finished, the standing ovation was immediate and thunderous. Johnny stood up and applauded along with everyone else. That, Johnny said into his microphone, is why you never ask an artist to be less than they are. Jim, that was extraordinary. Jim walked back to the guest chair, his face wet with tears, his body shaking from adrenaline and relief. Johnny shook his hand and spoke to the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to tell you something I don't often admit. I was wrong. I watched this young man's audition tape, and I saw impressions, and I thought, we don't need another impressionist. But what I didn't see was that Jim Carrey isn't just doing impressions. He's doing something completely original, and I almost made him hide that because I was stuck in my own ideas about what comedy should be. The audience applauded again, but this time it felt different. They weren't just applauding Jim's talent. They were applauding Johnny's humility, his willingness to admit a mistake on live television. After the show, in Johnny's dressing room, the two talked privately for almost an hour. Johnny said, "I need you to understand something. The reason I asked you not to do impressions wasn't because I didn't think you were talented. It was because I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" Jim asked. "Afraid that you'd become known as just an impressionist," Johnny explained. "Afraid that you'd spend your whole career copying other people instead of developing your own voice. But watching you tonight, I realized that for you, the impressions are your voice. They're not hiding who you are, they're revealing who you are." Johnny pulled out a bottle of scotch and poured 2 glasses, handing one to Jim. "I'm going to give you some advice, and you can take it or leave it," Johnny said. "Never let anyone, including me, tell you to be less than you are. The world is full of people who will try to put you in a box, who will try to make you fit their idea of what you should be. Most of them mean well. They think they're helping, but they're wrong. Your job as an artist is to be so completely yourself that no one can ignore you." Jim nodded, unable to speak. "And one more thing," Johnny continued, "the impressions are incredible, but don't let them become a crutch. Use them as a foundation to build something bigger. Create characters that are yours alone. Be influenced by everyone but be yourself." Ultimately, the Tonight Show episode aired exactly as it happened. Johnny's decision to stop Jim's bombing stand-up routine, his admission that he'd been wrong, Jim's explosive transformation when given permission to be himself, and America was captivated. The next morning, the phone in Jim's tiny Toronto apartment started ringing, and didn't stop for weeks. Agents wanted to sign him. Comedy clubs across America wanted to book him. Television producers wanted to meet with him. But more importantly, young comedians across North America saw something that gave them courage. They saw Johnny Carson, the king of late-night television, admit he was wrong on live TV. They saw him give a young artist permission to break the rule. They saw that being yourself, even when it's scary, especially when it's scary, is the only path to real success. Over the next decade, Jim Carrey would return to The Tonight Show 37 times. Each appearance showcased his evolution as a performer. The impressions remained, but Johnny had been right. Jim used them as a foundation to create original characters that were uniquely his, characters that would eventually make him one of the biggest movie stars in the world. Ace Ventura, The Mask, The Grinch. These weren't impressions of existing people. These were Jim Carrey originals built on the foundation of his gift for physical and vocal transformation. In 1994, when Jim was promoting The Mask and had become a genuine Hollywood star, he returned to The Tonight Show, now hosted by Jay Leno. After Johnny's retirement, during the interview, Jay brought up Jim's first appearance in 1978. "I've watched that episode 100 times, Jay said. "It's one of the most important moments in Tonight Show history, not just because of your performance, but because of what Johnny did. He could have let you fail quietly. Instead, he took a risk on live television and changed your life." Jim nodded, his eyes getting wet. "Johnny saved my career that night," Jim said. "But more than that, he taught me that trying to be what other people want is the surest path to failure. My whole life, I'd been poor, struggling, desperate to please people so they'd help me, help my family, and that desperation almost destroyed the one thing that made me special. Johnny saw that and stopped it. There's something else Jim rarely talked about publicly, but shared with close friends over the years. That night on The Tonight Show wasn't just about comedy or career. It was about his father. Percy Carey had given up on his own dreams of being a comedian because he thought he had to be practical, responsible, safe, and that safe choice had led to poverty, depression, and years of suffering. Jim had been about to make the same mistake, playing it safe, by doing standard stand-up instead of his impressions, trying to fit into someone else's idea of what he should be. But Johnny had stopped him, had given him permission to take the risk his father never took. When Jim called home after the show, Percy answered, "Dad," Jim said, barely able to speak. "You were right. I almost blew it by trying to be what I thought Johnny wanted, but he saw through it and made me be myself." "I know," Percy said quietly. "I watched. I'm proud of you." There was a long pause. "Dad, I'm going to make it," Jim said. "I'm going to do what you never got to do." "You already have, son," Percy replied. "You already have." Percy Carey lived to see his son become one of the most successful comedians and actors in the world. Before he passed away in 1994, he told a reporter, "Everything Jim Teeb started that night on The Tonight Show, when Johnny Carson gave him permission to be himself. That's all any of us need sometimes. Permission to stop pretending and start living." Jim kept that lesson close for his entire career. Even at the height of his fame, when the pressure to play it safe was enormous, when studios wanted him to repeat the same characters over and over, Jim remembered Johnny's words. "Never let anyone tell you to be less than you are." In interviews late in his career, Jim often talked about that night in 1978. "I was trying so hard to be what I thought success looked like," Jim explained to Oprah in 2009. "I thought I had to fit into this neat little box labeled comedian. But Johnny showed me that the box doesn't exist, or if it does, your job is to break it. That's what real artists do. They don't fit into existing categories. They create new ones." The impact of Johnny's decision that night rippled far beyond Jim's career. Other young comedians watching saw that taking risks could be rewarded. They saw that authenticity mattered more than playing it safe. They saw that even the king of late-night television could admit when he was wrong and change course in real time. Comedy clubs started encouraging performers to take bigger risks, to show their unique voices rather than imitating what had worked before. The whole culture began to shift slightly toward valuing originality over safety. And at the center of it all was that moment when Johnny Carson looked at a terrified 19-year-old and said, "Show me who you really are." In 2005, when Johnny Carson passed away, Jim Carrey was one of the first people to release a public statement. "Johnny Carson saved my career," Jim wrote, "but more importantly, he taught me how to save myself. He taught me that the biggest risk isn't bombing on stage. The biggest risk is succeeding at being someone you're not, because then you're trapped. You have to keep being that fake person forever." Johnny freed me from that trap before I even fell into it. The funeral was private, but Jim was there. In a small gathering, after the service, Jim spoke to Johnny's family. "I never got to properly thank him," Jim said. "I tried over the years, but Johnny always waved it off. He'd say, 'You did the work. I just got out of your way.' But that wasn't true. He didn't get out of my way. He cleared the path." There's a difference. One of Johnny's sons, who had heard this story many times, shared something Johnny had said privately. "Dad told me that night with you was one of his favorites." The son said, "Not because of the comedy, though that was great, but because he got to watch someone discover themselves in real time." He said, "That's what the show was really about. Not jokes, not entertainment. Watching people become who they were meant to be." Today, the clip of Jim Carrey's 1978 Tonight Show debut is studied in film schools and comedy classes. It's used as an example of the moment when pretense breaks and authenticity emerges, of the second when someone stops trying to please everyone else and starts being themselves, of the instant when fear transforms into freedom. But perhaps the most profound legacy of that night is simple. It's in every young performer who's ever been told to tone it down, to be less weird, to fit in. It's in every artist who's ever felt pressure to hide what makes them unique. It's in everyone who's ever tried to be what they think others want instead of who they actually are. Because Jim Carrey's story and Johnny Carson's role in it proves something essential, that your weird is your superpower. that the thing that makes you different is the thing that will make you successful, that trying to fit in is the most dangerous risk of all. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and share this video with someone who needs permission to be themselves today. Have you ever hidden your true talent because you thought it wouldn't be accepted? Have you ever had someone give you permission to be yourself? Share your story in the comments below. And remember, the next time you're tempted to play it safe, to be what you think others want, to hide what makes you unique, remember Jim Carrey standing on the Tonight Show stage in 1978. Remember Johnny Carson saying, "Show me who you really are," because the world doesn't need another copy of someone else. The world needs the original you. Be so completely yourself that no one can ignore you. That's the lesson. That's the legacy. That's what Johnny Carson taught Jim Carrey, and what Jim Carrey's story teaches all of us. Stop trying to fit in. Start showing up. The real you is the only you worth being.